Have you ever noticed that many times the body wants to stop, but the mind insists on continuing? The legs feel heavy, the arms lose strength, breathing becomes harder, and yet the mind says, I can keep going a little longer. This phenomenon is more common than it seems, and it doesn't happen by accident. In fact, it reveals something fundamental about how the human body works and about the relationship between the body and the brain. Fatigue doesn't appear all at once. It is built over time, and interestingly, it doesn't always start where we expect it to. Many people believe that the body gets tired because the muscles run out, as if energy simply ends all of a sudden, but the human body doesn't work that way. Physical fatigue is much more a decision of the brain than a collapse of the muscles. To understand this, we need to look at how the body manages energy and, more importantly, how the brain acts as a protective system. When you move, exercise, or perform any physical effort, your muscles consume energy. That energy comes mainly from molecules like ATP, produced from glucose, fat, and other energy substrates. At the same time, the body monitors many things at once: body temperature, oxygen levels, energy availability, the production of metabolic byproducts. None of this goes unnoticed. Sensors distributed throughout the body send constant information to the brain, especially to the central nervous system. The brain receives these signals and does something very important. It interprets risk. The goal is not maximum performance. The goal is survival. The brain does not want you to use all available energy. It wants to keep a reserve. That's why, before the muscles reach real failure, the brain begins to generate the sensation of fatigue. This sensation is not a defect. It is a warning. It is the body saying, if you keep going at this pace, something may get out of control. This mechanism is known as central fatigue. In other words, fatigue does not originate only in the muscles. It originates in the brain. It is the brain that reduces muscle activation. It is the brain that increases the perception of effort. It is the brain that creates the desire to stop. And here comes a curious point. The conscious mind does not always agree with this decision. The mind thinks about goals, objectives, deadlines, challenges. It is not directly connected to the biological sensors that monitor risk. That's why, many times, the mind wants to continue when the body is already signaling the need to pause. This explains why athletes, for example, can push beyond their limits in specific situations, not because the body stopped getting tired, but because the brain temporarily allowed greater use of its reserves. In situations of extreme motivation, adrenaline, or perceived necessity, the brain relaxes its protective limits. But this comes at a cost. The more often these limits are crossed, the greater the risk of exhaustion, injury, or physical collapse. In everyday life, something similar happens. You can be physically tired, but mentally active. This occurs because the conscious mind operates on a different level. Thinking, planning, deciding do consume energy, yes, but in a different way. The brain represents about 2% of body weight, but it consumes around 20% of the body's energy. Even so, the type of energy used by the brain does not collapse in the same way as muscles. That's why it's possible to feel intense physical fatigue and still continue reasoning, thinking, planning. The mind does not shut down because the body is tired. It simply receives the signal that physical effort needs to be reduced. Another important factor is the difference between peripheral fatigue and central fatigue. Peripheral fatigue is related to the muscles, the accumulation of metabolites, reduced muscle efficiency, local chemical changes. Central fatigue, on the other hand, is related to the brain and the nervous system. In most everyday situations, central fatigue appears first. It acts as an early break. This explains why, in many cases, after a short rest, the body seems to recover. The muscles did not fully regenerate in just a few minutes, but the brain reduced the perceived level of alert and risk. This phenomenon also helps explain why external stimuli can reduce the sensation of fatigue. Music, words of encouragement, a stimulating environment. All of this influences the brain, not the muscle directly. The muscle does not know whether you are motivated. The brain does. And it is the brain that decides how much of that muscle can be used. Another rarely discussed aspect is the role of expectation. If you believe you are close to your limit, the brain anticipates fatigue. If you believe there is still room to continue, the brain may allow more effort. This is not psychological in the common sense of the word. It is physiological, Expectation changes the interpretation of risk. That's why the same effort can feel light one day and heavy the next. The body is the same. The muscles are the same. The brain is not. Emotional state, stress level, sleep, nutrition. All of this changes how the brain interprets bodily signals. When you are emotionally exhausted, the brain becomes more conservative. It protects more. It generates fatigue earlier. This explains why mentally demanding days increase the sensation of physical fatigue. The body is not weak. The brain is cautious. Another important point is that fatigue is not only physical or mental, it is systemic. Hormones like cortisol, adrenaline, dopamine, and serotonin directly influence the perception of effort. When these systems are unbalanced, the body gets tired more quickly, not because it lost capacity, but because the brain adjusted its safety limits. This also explains why true recovery is not just about sleep. Sleep helps, but recovery also involves reducing stress, regulating emotions, and restoring hormonal balance. Ignoring bodily fatigue does not make the mind stronger, it only delays the adjustment. The body always collects the cost. Understanding that the body gets tired before the mind is not an invitation to give up. It is an invitation to intelligence. Knowing when to stop is not weakness. It is accurate signal reading. The body is not an enemy of the mind. It is a protective system. When you learn to interpret fatigue as information, not as an obstacle, everything changes. You begin to distribute effort better, to respect cycles, to recover before collapsing. Human functioning was not designed for continuous performance. It was designed for alternation, action and recovery, effort and pause, activation and rest. When this balance is respected, the body responds better, and the mind does too. Maybe the real question is not why the body gets tired before the mind. Maybe the question is why we insist on ignoring what the body is trying to communicate. Fatigue is not failure, it is language, and the body speaks before it's too late. If you want to better understand how the human body truly works, subscribing to the channel is a way to follow upcoming content. Here, the goal is to explain what happens inside the body in a clear, simple way based on real human functioning.